baby, how was school today?
Mom, these kids at school kept making fun of me and they kept calling my hair nappy. Why, Mom?
Tootie, look, just read this book and it'll tell you everything you need to know.
There's another N-word we throw around in and out of the black community called nappy. We have taken that word like the other N-word, nigger, and made it a word of adornment. I have heard the word nappy my entire life, which was used to insult, degrade, and hurt someone. This word is a derogatory term that was used in our ancestors to insult them.
Available now.
I love myself.
Same tree, different brand.
I hope you love yourself, because love is only love when you love somebody else.
What hair looks like after slavery. Transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade by the European changes everything for Central and West Africans. Let's briefly talk about the transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese and later the English, the French, and the Dutch got involved in enslaving Africans in large parts of West Africa, the Gulf Coast of Guyana, and the Congo River Basin, were significant areas of human exports to the Americas, mostly to sugar plantations in the Caribbean. By the late 17th century, the so-called triangle trade developed. European ships loaded with guns, textiles, tobacco, and manufacturing goods sailed to Africa's slave ports and traded those goods for captives. European slave traders then took those Africans to the New World, where they were sold. With that money, the European purchased staples such as sugar, tobacco, rum, and coffee, then sold for enormous profits back in Europe. The profits was often reinvested in other goods to be traded for captives back in Africa, and so on. If you want more in-depth information on the transatlantic slave trade, I recommend you read Hugh Thomas' book titled The Slave Trade, the story of the Atlantic slave trade 1440 through 1870. This is a thick book, roughly 912 pages, and worth sacrificing some of your time to read. The book is almost the same price as a supersized combo from a fast food restaurant, destroying the image of African hair. Europeans who had traded and communicated with Africans knew the complexity and the significance of black hair. They were often struck by the various hairstyles that they saw within each community. In an effort to dehumanize and break the African spirit, Europeans shaved the heads of enslaved Africans upon arrival to the Americas. This was not merely a random act, but a symbolic removal of African culture. The shaving of the hair represents the removal of any trace of African identity and further acts to dehumanize.
Peace to everybody out there, man. In the chat, please like the show, share the show, tell a friend, we're live. It's your boy Sean P in the place to be. Lafayette, John Murray, and Boca to all my West Africans out there. You know what I'm saying? Halito to the fake Indians and the real Indians. You know what I mean? Before we get started, I do want to wish all the fathers out there again, happy Father's Day to everybody that is a father. And those of you who will be fathers soon. We're here today because I wanted to go over this information on a prior show, but unfortunately I was unable to do so. The conversation the way the conversation was going, it didn't allow an opportunity for the information to be presented. So I want to slow things down, and I want to actually properly do this thing now. Real quick. So on Not a Coincidences channel, we got introduced to this guy's name is Florida. What's his name, Sute? Florida, some weird dude, right? White man. Okay. He is the source for autonomous or autochthonous or whatever he want to call himself Autonomous One and Aboriginal Power. They're relying on him for some of the information, if not all. Now, on our C channel, we looked up some of the stuff that was being claimed on a previous show that the dude did when he came and he sat down on Sarnetta's panel with which is a problem because it allows the opportunity for propaganda to be pushed and a narrative to be guided. However, in this guy's claim, he claimed basically the biblical story happened in Florida. And off the coast in the Gulf, there's this island that was just the perfect place for humanity to do its thing. And that's how people been here. And that Florida has one of the biggest maritime shipbuilding places, a whole bunch of foolery, right? Yeah, I know that he's all imagination, but he is the root of a lot of their imagination. They're on the panel with him right now. Ask Sutek, because he was watching it. But the guy led us to a different guy, I forget his name, something. And come to find out, he was running in 1936. He was running for governor of Florida. He's the one who projected or made all of these claims. And he's an author of a book that's pseudo. And there's an interview out there existing of this particular person. But these are the things that they are peddling in the community. This guy, this old world Florida guy, is pushing right now, a show right now on the Moors and Kemetic stuff. Why would indigenous people to the Americas give two shits about Egypt? What's the correlation? That goes back to that narrative that Truth Seeker, your boy Truth Seeker, was kicking that day that he tried to cuss me out, and he tried to play nice, and then he tried to cuss me out, and he got caught out on his bullshit, where he says that they were indigenous to the Americas. They left the Americas and went to Africa and built civilizations. See? If you listen close enough, even when I'm confrontational, what I've developed is the ability to be confrontational and still have the know-it-all, right? To argue out of my mouth, but hear everything you're saying while I'm being contentious. Even if I'm over talking you, I still hear you and I can process what it is that you're presenting to me, which is bullshit. So, as expected, for the rest of 2023, they will be aligning with the white man. You know, the same white man that they're saying you're using white sources, the same white man that they say that is wrong about shit, the same white man that they're saying that that's your master, that white man. So where you at? Root word, where you at? Smoke signal. Y'all are the biggest proponents of always bringing up the white man. But here go y'all teachers, y'all leaders who challenge and panels y'all be on, aligning themselves with a pseudo-ass spooked out white man. This is what y'all have succumbed to because you cannot stand up, and he ain't even gonna help. He's so fucking far out, right? That you could sense the stench of pseudo in him. So I want to go over with you all today. Let me move on. I want to go over with you all today this article that was written in JSTOR, was published in JSTOR, and it has a host of other sources. Now, I provided this on Not a Coincidence's channel. I don't know if he ever got an opportunity to pull that link up. and read the actual source. I do know that Sutek read the source because he was mentioning it last night and he took an interest to that source. And from what he gathered from it, right, is similar to what I gathered from it, and it refutes the claim on who labeled who. So what we're going to do is we're going to analyze that information, and we're going to put to bed this whole copper red color theme, right? We're going to put it to rest. Now, remember the shows that I did before that, we talked about lookership, phenotype, right? We use science to establish specific facial features and gene types that exist not only in the skin coat, the skin, but the nose, the lips, and the jawbone, right? These distinct genes that belong in the indigenous group or the Amerindian, or what we want to call the Paleo-Indian, right? This is what makes them distinct. This also puts them here before anyone else. And anyone claiming to be them, they don't possess those traits. So therefore, there's a wider gap. So science is pushing them away. History is pushing them away. And now we're working with their teachers because they're doing shows. They're on the panels with their teachers. Now we know how they are aligned. Now we know where this silly shit come from. And it goes back to Cash and his whole perspective of behind every pseudo is a white man. So, what up, Nada C? What up, Dez? What up, Zane? What up, Benita? Sister Benita? Happy Father's Day, man. Bar Reloaded in the building, Infinite Mind in the building. It's a couple more people in the building. They hadn't said anything yet. I'm pretty sure that there may file some people in here. May not. It's 10:30 on the Eastern Coast. Nada C doesn't have to go to work. He using up his paternity leave. I still think he on that shit. You know. So so you know, it is what it is. So for those people that will come in, man, you know, they'll just have to catch up or catch the replay or check out the sources in the description. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen. I gave you my soliloquy. Now it's time to build. I am going to take my time with you, and I'm going to read this source. All right. So for those of you who don't like the reading hour, you have entered the reading hour. And this is substantial information, and we're going to use every bit of it. So this article is written by none other than Nancy Shoemaker. She does a great job of outlining things, sourcing, and then allowing you an opportunity to get more in-depth information. What I mean by the more in-depth information is basically, if you look at the bottom of the screen, she gives you some other things that you can go and refer to. So nothing is jumbled up here. Everything is quite nice. I'm trying to zoom in as far as I can get it to make it look pretty on y'all. And that's the best. Oh, my bad. That's the best I could do. Yeah. Oh. Hold on. I got to log back in. My screen refresh. It's just been sitting on my screen this whole entire time. Did they take away one of my nope, they didn't. I still got 120. All right. There we go. So let me get myself off the screen. And no sense in looking at me. I ain't nothing to look at. All right, there we go. So let me see how this look. All right, let's go. Okay, so scholars working on the history of race as an idea assumed the Europeans were the sole inventors of it. I'm going to say that again. Scholars working on the history of race as an idea assume that that Europeans were the sole inventors of it. So let me do you a favor. Let me take you down here to source number one so you can understand where the argument is coming from. This argument is held in, there are a few exceptions. Frank de Courtier, de Couture, or Otter, The Discourse of Race in Modern China, Hiroshima Wagasuma, The Social Perception of Skin Color in Japan, In Color and Race, John Hope Franklin edition, Boston, 1968, page 125 to 65. I am here using race in a limited sense by focusing on skin color. For other applications, see, for example, John M. Efron, Defenders of the Race, Jewish Doctors in Race Science in Fendi, Cecile, Europe. So you know where that's going. Now, undeniably, race, the belief that people can be categorized by observable physical differences such as skin color, flourished within the earlier modern European slave trade. Sometime in the 18th century, race outpaced the older categories of Christian and pagan to become the primary justification for expropriating the land of the labor of others. As a system of categorizing people, race fulfilled Europe's ideological needs by creating the illusion that human differences was biologically ordained. But as Europeans spun their web of racial hierarchies, what were non-European thinking about race? Historians have yet to tackle this question in depth. Instead, focuses on how whites constructed images of others. This approach to the historical emergence of race as a system for categorizing people replicates what it purports to critique. Since the emphasis of European images making coincide American Indians and other non-white people the passive role in the construction of knowledge, they exist only as the objects of white observation, and the power to label or name resides with Europeans. One example of this tendency is the standard explanation of how Indians got to be red. European explorers saw that Indians wore red paint, and so they called them, peep this, so they called them red. And from white man to redskin, changing Anglo-American perception of the American Indian, Alden Vaughan moved toward correcting this misconception. There's a misconception. When he instead credited the Swedish naturalist Carlos Linnaeus with making red a racial category in his 1740 edition in Systema Naturae. So how Linnaeus arrived at red remains a small mystery. He may have heard of red-painted Indians, but the Greek physician Galen's medical philosopher of the four humors must also have served inspiration. For in the 1758 edition of Systema Naturae, Linnaeus attached the telltale descriptive labels of each color of people. Red people were chloric, white, sangarine, yellow, melancholic, and black, phlegmatic. Thus, Linnaeus adapted an existing system of color-based categories to account for differences between the world's people. However, giving Linnaeus sole credit perpetuates another misconception. Linnaeus chose red as a category. Hopefully y'all can see that. He chose red as a category for Indians, but he was not the first person to do so. More than a decade before the 1740 edition of Systema Naturae, American Indians, listen y'all, particularly Indians in the Southeast, were already calling themselves red. So let me run that back. Before any Swedish or European person can label these people red, American Indians were already calling themselves red. I want you to digest this information right now. So when you hear this whole copper color or this, well, not copper color, but this infusion or this assumption of red, the Indians were already doing it. Now, this article discusses when, how, and why Southeastern Indians introduced the term red people or red men into the language of Indian-European contact. It then explores what red meant to the Southeastern Indian group, the Cherokees, in their initial encounters with English colonists and in the later accounts with Americans, while lineage groped toward an explanation of difference embedded in the human body. 18th century Southeastern Indians, in dialogue with Europeans, drew on their own color symbolism to develop categories that could account for biological, cultural, and political differences. I'm going to say that again. The Indians had already established categories that would account for their biological makeup, their cultural differences, and their worldview politically. What up, Keenan? By the mid-1720s, from Louisiana to South Carolina, Indians were claiming the category red for themselves in the area of Indian-European diplomacy. In 1725, the French asked a group of Indians to counsel Mobile whether they would like to become a Christian and recorded Tayanas' chief's response. Hold on. Somebody messaged me. Oh, that should lead. That was up. Appreciate it. All right. Here's what the chief had to say. Long ago, there were 3 men in a cave. One white, one red, one black. The white man went out first and he took to the good road that led him into a fine hunting ground. The red man, who was an Indian, they called themselves in their language red men, went out of the cave second. He went astray from the good road and took another, which led him into a country where the hunting was less abundant. The black man, who was the Negro, having been the third man to go out, got entirely lost in a very bad country in which he did not find anything on which to live. Since that time, the red man and the black man have been looking for the white man to restore them to the good road. This Chinese chief divided humankind into 3 color-based categories. Moreover, his French audience understood red man to be an Indian contribution to the lexicon of French settlement in North America. While this story was being told to the French near the Mississippi River, Indians further to the east were introducing the term red people into the English Indian diplomacy. In George Chicken's journal of 1725 delegation to Cherokees, several Chickasaws arrived at the council and said they wanted peace with the white people and desired to have their own way and to take revenge of the red people, by which they meant the Creek Indians. Throughout the journal, Chicken himself calls Indians simply Indians. A year later, the English in South Carolina negotiated a peace between the Creeks and the Cherokee. Adhering to the diplomatic custom, a Creek headman, Chingalee, offered a large white eagle's wing to the Cherokees and said he wanted peace with them. The Cherokee speaker responded, "I see your white wing there, but shall not receive it till I find you'll be good to the white people, nor will I tell you talk further. It is now come to this. We are the red people now met together. Our flesh is both alike, but we must have further talk with you." Later in council, the Creek allied Kowtow warrior called Cherokees, those red people. They called the Cherokee those red people, and other Indian speaker remarked that the great men of the white and red people are now friends, and it shall never be my fault if this peace is broke. In the council transcript, the phrase red people appears only within the speeches of Indian delegates. One more time. This is only mentioned in the transcript of who? The red people, the Indian delegates. Red Indians quickly became standard usage in southeastern Indian diplomacy. By the 1730s, the French in Louisiana had incorporated red men into the language of French Indian diplomacy and had adopted the term as a generic label for Indians in their own correspondence. By the late 1750s, the English in the southeastern addressed Indians as red people. Although the English used the term less often than Indian speakers, and usually only in response to an Indian speech. In every instance, red men and red people were forms of addressing unaccompanied by the European descriptions of Indians. Antoine Simon-Lepage Duprat, a French farmer in Louisiana, who later wrote a book about his experiences called Indians Hommes Rouges, but believed that they were born white and then turned brown as they are rubbed with bear's oil and exposed to the sun. Other Europeans also commented on how Indians looked and what color they were, either with paint or without paint, but rarely was the color red. 18th century account of Indians tended to follow the pattern set by the earliest European explorers of Southeast in the Spanish and describe Indians as brown of skin, but painted in oak red, red, black, white, yellow, and vermilion in stripes. The skin color Europeans most commonly attributed to Indians was tawny. Y'all remember that word? You have heard it before when the Europeans mention it, tawny. Thus, ethnographic descriptions of Indians mention a multitude of colors only in the language of 18th century French Indian and English Indian diplomacy were Indians red people. There are two likely scenarios for why Indians began to identify themselves as red. First, red may have been an Indian response to meeting strange new people who called themselves white, to distinguish themselves from their black or Negro slaves. Second, some Indians may have considered themselves red or been called so by other Indians before the arrival of Europeans. Actually, these are not mutually exclusive scenarios, but instead work in combination. In a variety of situations, red was a local category for Indians to claim for themselves. And then, just as the Columbus misnomer Indian spread to people at great distances from Columbus, the Caribbean in 1492, the process of Indian-European contact gradually made red a generic label for all Indians. The first scenario suggests that a kind and dialect took place. Europeans called themselves white and Indians responded with red. The best evidence for this scenario is the rarity of red Indians in the Northeast in contrast to comparable records of the Southeast. Origin stories like the one of the Tanos chief told the French must have circulated to some extent among Northeastern Indians. For a baptized Delaware Indian in Ohio area told a Jesuit in 1757 that the Trinity had created men as we find them upon earth as red, black, and white, and that they had destined one for praying, another for hunting, and another for war. Other rare uses of red men in Northeast can be linked to Leonites. Per Kalm, a Swedish naturalist and Leonidas protege, mentioned red men several times in the journal of his trip from Delaware to Canada. Kalm's visit with Benjamin Franklin may have inspired Franklin's observation concerning the increase of mankind, which listed Indians among the world's tawny peoples, but then ambiguously proposed excluding all blacks and tawnies from peoples from America so that the lovely white and red could prevail. Despite an occasional red in the historical record for the Northeast, when in council with English, Northeastern Indians did not call themselves red and were not called red by others. What had by mid-century become commonplace in the language of Southeastern Indian diplomacy was still a novelty in the Northeast. Indian languages provided further evidence that the idea of red Indians was indigenous to the Southeast. From the St. Lawrence to the upper Mississippi, the word Indian, when interpreted into native languages, usually came to be equated with the native word for people, sometimes translated as men, real people, or original people. All right, that's what the word native to them meant. The contemporary French historian Bacqueville de la Potherie observed this pattern in the Great Lakes region when he wrote of Indian telling the fur trader Parrot that when the men arrived, they would render him thanks. It is thus that all savages are designated among themselves, while they call the French French and other people from Europe by the names of respective nations. In contrast, hold on one second. Excuse me. In contrast, in Southeastern Indian languages, the word or phrase meaning Indian originates in the word of the color red. A 19th century glossary of Natchez words collected by anthropologist Daniel Britton translate Indian red man into there's no other symbols, is just TVMH. So I would suggest I'm gonna do this like we do with Medu Neter, Tevime, Peck up. That means man red. In Choctaw and Chickasaw, closely related to Muskegon languages, the word for Indian is Hatek Api Hama. A combination of Hatek, which means man, and Hama means red. And in R.M. Lutheran's dictionary of Muskegon Creek Indian is given an Este Kate, which means man red. Because Indian speeches made their way into the historical record only after being translated into European English, it is difficult to know exactly what was said at these councils. There must have been an instance when an Indian speaker said Hatek Api Hama, and the interpreter said it in English, Indian. But when Englishmen said Indian and Frenchmen said savage, when indeed the interpreters turned to the Choctaws or Chickasaws and say Hatek Api Hama, at some point in the dialogue between Indians and Europeans, Indians came to mean red men or red people in the native languages of Southeastern Indians. My bad. My Apple mouse is so sensitive. All right, we on page. Now, the southeastern origins of red Indians is good evidence for the first scenario. Hopefully you can see that. I'm trying to look and see. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna read it again. The southeastern origin of red Indians is good advice for the first scenario that Indians call themselves red in response to meeting people who call themselves white, because Europeans settling the southeast did indeed have a white identity. In the early 1700s, Carolina colonists, many of whom had immigrated from Barbados, already divided their world into white, black, and Indians. The first English colony to develop a plantation economy depended on the slave labor. Barbados may have also been the first English colony to experience the transition in identity from Christian to white. For those of you who had no idea, yes, the white people were just calling themselves Christian. They were not calling themselves white people originally. They were using the Christian word. Now, one mid-17th century visitor to Barbados who wrote of Negroes, Indians, and Christians told an anecdote that may explain why white replaced Christian. A slave wished to become Christian. There you go. But the slave's master responded that we cannot make a Christian a slave, nor a slave a Christian. For being once a Christian, he could no more count him a slave, and so lose the hold they have on them as slaves by making them Christian. By the end of the 17th century, Barbadans who were neither black nor Indian were well on their way to becoming white. When they left Barbados for Carolina, they brought Negro slaves, an emerging white identity with them. Now, Christians in the Northeast lagged several decades behind the Southern counterparts in self-identifying as white. The Dutch and New Netherlands called themselves Christian for the duration of control over the colony, and the English continued with Christian until about the 1730s, when the term white people began to appear with more frequency, as in Barbados. Black slavery seems to have caused the transition from Christian to white. In the 1740s, Sir William Johnson, British Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the Northeast, wrote most often about relations between Christians and Indians. But when Johnson solicited an acquaintance to buy him some Negroes, for Johnson did own black slaves, he also asked for an indentured servant, a good cliver lad of a white man. When English settlers in Carolina first met Indians, they called themselves white people. Again, a term that could be literally translated into native languages. A different naming process must have occurred in the Northeast because Christian cannot be translated into native languages. Instead, the names Indians invented for Europeans predominated. The Iroquois, for example, called Europeans hatchet makers. In English translation of Indian speeches, Indian speakers seem to be using Christian in the 17th century and white people by the mid-18th century, but probably it was the interpreters who changed, first interpreting the Iroquois for the hatchet makers into Christian and later into white people. The Southeast also makes sense for the second component of the dialectic. Why Indians responded with red instead of yellow, brown, or even tawny. Red and white symbols articulating a dualism between war and peace permitted Southeastern Indian cultures. White was their fixed emblem of peace, friendship, happiness, prosperity, purity, holiness, etc. The white path meant peaceful relations between towns or nations. The red or bloody path meant war. War chiefs painted blood red and civil chiefs painted white, milk white, shared political authority within towns, and towns themselves were designated white or red as a means to delegate intertribal responsibilities in times of peace and war. Red and white were, therefore, metaphors of more ties or complementary divisions within Southeastern Indian societies. Although northern tribes such as the Iroquois understood red and white, symbols to stand for war and peace, the juxtaposition of red and white rarely figured the discourse of the ritual of Iroquois diplomacy. For Southeastern Indians, red would have been the logical rejoinder to white. Indeed, at the 725-726 councils with the English mentioned earlier, Indians who spoke bringing red people and white people together may have meant people who advocated war and people who advocated peace. The English did appear as peacemakers at these councils, and the Indians may have thought that was why they were calling themselves white people. The English, meanwhile, probably understood the Indian phrase red people to be only a reference to complexion. If you heard me and what I basically just said, when the white people was calling themselves white, they could have been calling themselves white in reference to the Indians' word for white, meaning peace. Meaning that they were peace advocates. I wonder how well that worked. Now, the first scenario for how Indians got to be red fits English Southeastern, but less neatly explains why red men made its way into French Indian diplomacy. The language evidence in the same in the Mabolian trade jargon, the Volga tongue, in which the French and Indians communicated the words for Indian, European, and African were rooted in the words for the colors red, white, and black. And the French Louisiana had négriers, slaves, and bloc identity. Andre Pennicotte, a member of the Pierre Monet d'Iberville's in a 1698 expedition to Lower Mississippi, explained the Indians' curiosity about the French as caused by them being astonished at seeing white-skinned people Later, when offered as many as women as they were men in our party, Iberville held out his hand to the Indians and made them understand that their skin, red and tan, should not come close to that of the French, which was white. This is incidentally one of the few references to Indians having red skin elsewhere in this account. Pennicott described Indians as having very tawny skin. In contrast, the English in the Carolina, however, French did not persistently refer to themselves as white people, but self-identified more often by nationality, les Francas. The transcripts of Indian European councils reveal another difference. When in conversation with the English, Indians usually paired red people and white people as though they were thinking of complementary mortals. In the French records, red men appears alone, suggesting that red emerged independently from French claims to the category white. The second scenario for the origins of red, here we go, fits French-Indian relations better. Early in the explorations of the Mississippi, the French encountered several Indian groups who already had red identities. Red men, once introduced into the diplomatic discourse by one Indian tribe, might have spread geographically and become part of the language of the people unfamiliar with its origin. The French planter Lepage du Prat implied that this was the case. Although he sometimes called the Natchez Homes rogues, he also wrote, "When the Natchez retired to this part of America where I saw them, they were found several nations, or rather the remains of several nations, some of the east, others on the west, and others in the Mississippi. These are the people who are distinguished among the natives by the name of the red men, and their origin is so much the more obscure as they have not so distinct a tradition as the Natchez. Undoubtedly, one such tribe was the Hamas, a Muskegon people in the lower Mississippi Valley, whose names translate into English as red. Early French expeditions of the Southeast, headed by La Salle and Iberville in 1680s and 1690s, encountered Umas near the mouth of Mississippi. But these exploring parties communicated with Indians largely by signs, and neither La Salle nor Iberville translated Uma into red, or seemed to be aware of what it meant. In the early meetings with Indians along with the Mississippi, as French worked to acquire the rudiments of native languages, they may have inadvertently used native ways of speaking in such a way as to popularize red men as a catchphrase for all Indians. How and when certain tribes came to be called red is unclear. There seems to have been some connection between the red identity and the origin stories. According to anthropologist John R. Swinton, the Homas and the neighboring Chacchimas owe their tribal names to the red crawfish that created the earth. Peep it. Another red tribe whom French encountered in explorations further to the north were the Muskegees, or red earths, whose origin story tells how the first man and the first woman were made out of clay that was red as blood. Origin stories such as these could also be adapted to account for differences between peoples. A 20th century folklorist recorded that the Sulkies say jokingly that Gichi Manito made the Suki out of yellow clay and the Squawky out of red. Just as some Indians use animals to create metaphorical social divisions called totems or clans, Southeastern Indians may have used their heritage landscape to explain differences between peoples. European explorers of the Southeast were especially struck by the colors of the land. One trader saw a Chickasaw country. The land here is a thin mold of a top of a red stiff clay on a white marl. Lepage de Prats characterized Louisiana as abounding in red clay, although the white hill near the Natchez had several veins of the earth that is white, greasy and very fine, with which I have seen very good potters were made. On the same hill, there are vines of okra, of which the Natchez had just taken some to stain the earthenware, which looked well enough when it was bed smeared with okra, it became red or burning. An Englishman described what was probably the same hill as being made of white clay streaked with red and yellow. And later in his journey, he remarked reddish soil, somewhat like red ochre, which the Indians used instead of vermilion. Then they cannot get the lather. Now, before European trade introduced vermilion, Indians made paint out of clay, and paint marked social positioning. Again, the paint marked social positioning. So when you see them painting themselves, it has a social position related to it, and more. Whether one was for war or peace, for example. The colors of the land match the color of symbolism of Southeastern Indians in other contexts. The Tensas were related to the Natchez and lived near this white, red, and yellow clay cliff. Replicated these colors in their temple, which French Jesuits described as having on the outside 3 figures of eagles made of wood and paint, red, yellow, and white. Inside the temple themselves held baskets of idols, including figures of men and women made of stone and baked clay. These figures might have been references to the Tynes's origin story. If it resembled that of the Natchez, according to Lepage de Prats, the guardian of the Natchez temple, having told me that God had made man with his own hands. I asked him if he knew how that was done. He answered that God had knitted some clay, such as that which potters use, and had made it into a little man, and that after examining it and finding it well formed, he blew up his work, and forthwith the little man had life, grew, acted, walked, and found himself a man perfectly well shaped. Lepage de Prats did not ask whether God used red, white, or yellow clay. Not all Indians believe that people originated in clay. H.B. Cushman, writing in the 19th century, recorded that in regard to the origin of man, the one story generally accepted among the Choctaws, as well as many other tribes, was that man and all other forms of life had originated from the common Mother Earth through the agency of the Great Spirit, that the human race sprang from many different primeval pairs created by the Great Spirit in various parts of the earth, in which man was found, and according to the different natural features of the world in which man abide, so their views varied with regard to the substance of which man was created, whether from trees, from rocks, or from the earth. The stories Lepage de Prats and Cushman heard may have been the same stories told among the Natchez and the Choctaws before the arrival of the Europeans. New stories created for the benefit of European listeners, or old stories adjusted to the account for the existence of the Europeans. Origin stories in the historical record are naturally suspect. They often appear with accounts of missionaries who were eager to hear native explanations of how a world was created so that they could correct them and tell them how the world really was created. And anticipating what missionaries wanted to hear, Indians were already acquainted with the biblical account, may have recycled some versions of it into the missionaries' benefit. Curiously, at least one proselytizing Christian, Roger Williams of Rhode Island, faithfully translated Hebrew word Adam, which means red earth or soil, into an Algonquin language. Consequently telling Indians that God had made the first man out of red earth. However, Williams' Indian acquaintances rejected his version, insisting that God carved the first people out of stone, but dissatisfied with the results, made them from a tree instead. Since the 17th century, New England Indians were not thought of as red. Williams' origin story lacked a political content and could have assumed in other times and places. And yet, if missionaries elsewhere followed Williams' example, some Indians might have found this origin story compatible with their own, or a story worth appropriating. 18th century Europeans were themselves engaged in the struggle to keep the truth of the origin story alive, despite the challenge to its incurred with the European discovery of the Americas. The rise of the black slavery was just one cause behind the collapse of Christian and pagan as a system of categories and the emergence of new categories based on the science of race. A second reason for the shift to a new set of categories must have been the hard questions posed by the existence of Indians. Were Indians descended from Adam and Eve, or were they separate creations? Were Indians to the lost tribe of Israel? Were they on the ark of Noah? As Europeans debated how to fit Native Americans into the biblical account or human origins, Indians must have been discussing how to fit appearance of these new people, Europeans and Africans, into their stories of human creation. I want you to think about that. Even if you like arguing about religion and so on and so forth, you have to remember the Europeans never encountered these people when they already had this whole story about Adam and Eve and how the world came to be in Noah's Ark, right? So now you got different renditions, but let's continue. So as Europeans debated how to fit Native Americans into the biblical account of human origins, Indians had to do the same, okay, for Europeans and Africans. All right, so like the Genesis story, Natchez and Choctaw stories describe the divine origins of humans, but could also be adapted to explain or allow for differences among humans. Indians, Europeans, and Africans came out of the ground in different places and thus were different people. Now, but were they then or a different race? The first scenario of how Indians got to be red as a response to white, suggests that red and white were metaphors for assumed positions, like school colors today, and not racial categories rooted in biological difference. The second scenario, positing a pre-contact identity as red based on beliefs about origins, raises the possibility that Indians came to see red and white as designating innate, divinely ordained differences between peoples. Were white and red in European Indian diplomacy intended as symbols that could be put on and taken off, or did they refer to differences thought to be embedded in the body and skin color? Unfortunately, there is no simple answer. James Adair certainly thought that Indians had their own racial identity. A trader who lived for many years with the Cherokees and Chickasaws, Adair later tried to prove in his History of the American Indians that Indians descended from Jews. Like many of his contemporaries, Adair believed that the Indian color is not natural, but came from their method of living. However, he also wrote that the Indians were of a copper or red clay color and are so strongly attached to and prejudiced. Yeah, you heard me say copper or red clay color, right? Coming from this guy that believed that they were Jews. Indians are strongly attached to and prejudiced of favor of color, their own color, that they think as mentally of the whites, and we possibly can do of them. His phrase is red clay color is unusual and may have come from conversation with Indians, not from his own observation. More suggestive of race were 18th century Indians' efforts to determine social identity through empirical biological criteria. A trader to the Cherokees told of how they had killed an enemy who was, by his confession, the over-the-lake Indian, and by his whiteness, they supposed him to be the white man's son. Another trader described an incident in which the Twaiti Miami Indians visiting the Shawnees denied that they had brought either scalps or prisoners. The Shawnees, suspecting them, had the curiosity to search their bags and finding 2 scalps in them that by the softness of the hair did not feel like Indian scalps. They washed them clean and found them to be the scalps of some Christians. Remember, Christians meaning who? White people. As the science of race emerged in Europe, Indians were similarly reading meaning into observational bodily differences as a way to find order in an increasingly complicated world. Another kind of racialism is evident outside the Southeast in speeches made by Indians who, even though they did not call themselves red people, challenged European claims to power by a certain racial identity. So, in the 1740s, the Iroquois speaker in council with the English emphasized Iroquois independence by highlighting the racial divide between Europeans and Indians. The world, at least, was made of the side of the greater water different from what is on this side, as may be known from the different colors of our skin and our flesh. and that which you call justice may not be amongst us. You have your laws, custom, and so have we. And in the 1750s, Indians began promoting a pan-Indian resistance by evoking racial ties, as when the Delawares and the Shawnees appealed to the Iroquois to take up the hatchet against the white people without distinction, for all of the skin color was one color, and the Indians of the another. And if the Six Nations would streak the French, they would have struck the English. Northeastern Indians may have been incorporating a concept Europeans introduced to them that skin color was significant, or they came to this idea on their own. Thus, the 18th century Indians did use biology either to reveal identity or to build a common identity. However, most often, Indians used red and white for their rhetorical power as metaphors intended to capture the essence of social relationships. Closer examinations of the three contexts in which the Cherokees placed themselves in a red category shows that the Cherokees adopted color-based categories as a strategy to inform the English about social obligation. Two of these examples come from the trader Alexander Long's 1725 postscript. In this document, neither Long nor the Cherokee conjure he spoke to refer to the Indians as red explicitly, but the Cherokees, by implication, fell into a red category. The third example comes from the 1730 Cherokee English Council held in London. First, however, there's a complication that requires explanation. Cherokee language has two red colors. Ajigaj is a bright red originating in the Cherokee word for blood. Wodige, I think that's how you say it, which usually translates as brown, is a red-brown color derived from the Cherokee word for red paint, wadi, which was made out of red clay before the Cherokees acquired a vermilion in trade. Interpreters might have translated either word into English as red. These two colors have strong associations because of the Cherokees use red-brown face paint to evoke blood-red natural powers of the body. Anthropologist Raymond Fogelson depicted this connection as gendered. The face paint worn by warriors and associated with death complemented the menstrual blood and life-giving powers of women. A mid-18th century dictionary compiled by the German engineer of the word English for in Cherokee country demonstrates the obscure boundary between Ajigaje and the Wodige, between the social and the biological. I'm saying this shit like African. Indian is given as Wodakihi, suggesting that the red people in council transcripts came from the Wodiji, but the dictionary then translates Wodakihi as Indian painted man, not red man. The following three Cherokee examples invoke both Ajigeji and Wodeji. In the same year as the Tawnees chief told, the Tansas chief told this story about the white, red, and black man emerging from a cage. Long interviewed a Cherokee priest or conjuror to gauge the Cherokees' receptivity to Christian missionaries. The conjurer answered Long in much the same way as the Tawny chief by telling an origin story. In the beginning, everything was water. The great man above gave a crawfish some dirt to spread and then made the sun and moon. After he had made all living things, he took some white clay and made the white man and one white woman. And then he made Toe and two of every nation under the sun. He's saying nation under the sun. Women and man. They have increased ever since. But I think that the English are the first that he made because he was endued them with knowledge of making all things. Interesting. Although it is left unsaid what color clay nations were made from, Cherokee land, lying in what is now northeastern Georgia, eastern Tennessee, and the western Carolinas, is one of the regions in North America most noted for its extensive banks of red clay. The conjurer told another story that positioned Indians as red, but this time he linked skin color to the abstractly colored gods of the four directions. The god in the north was a black god colored like the Negro, and he was a very cross. That in the east is the color of the us Indians, and he is something better than the other. Other sources call the gods in the east red, Ajigaji. He that in the south is a very good one, and the white as yo English are, and so mild that we love him out of Meshore. Yo are whiter than all other nations of people under the sun. The great king of the heaven has given you knowledge of all things. Surely he has a great love for you than us and for thus of the Negroes. So they're conceding, right, to this thought process the Europeans are somehow smarter than everybody else. And you're hearing this from two different groups of people, not the same group. It's two different groups. Now, it was not until Long pressed him for the information about the fourth god that Conjure found a color for him. He was the color of the Spaniards. In other accounts of the gods of the four directions, his color would have been blue. But blue mean had no parallel in the Nazian's racial categories in Southeast. The conjurer's reluctance to take the story to an implausible conclusion, Blue Spaniards, reveals the reason for his storytelling. Long thought he was gathering information on Cherokee's religious beliefs, but the conjurer was tailoring his story for his audience. The origin story was probably a fabrication too. A familiar plot for additional expository details, most notably the idea that whites were created first. In both stories, the conjurer flattered Long with differences to the white superiority, but when asked directly about whether the Cherokees would like missionaries to come among them, he expressed doubts about their efficacy. For these white men that lives amongst us a trading are more debauched and more wicked than the beatest of our young fellows. Is it not a shame for them that has such good priests and such knowledge as they have to be worse than the Indians that are in a manner but like wolves? With those narratives, the conjurer intended to instruct Long in how white people should behave. In the third example, in 1730 treaty signing in London, the Cherokee speaker claimed the category red in yet another context. This treaty originated in the bizarre ambitions of the English eccentric Sir Alexander Cumming, who on his own initiative visited the Cherokees and invited 7 of them to London to meet the king's seafront peace. When they got there, the 7 Cherokees found themselves part of a treaty negotiations in which the English speaker said that since the Cherokee were now in the children of the great king of the Great Britain and their father, they must be always ready for the governor's command to fight against any nation, whether they be white men or Indians, who shall dare to molest or hurt the English. The English also sought good trading relations, the return of escaped slaves, the legal jurisdiction in the murders between Cherokees and colonists, the seal of terms of the treaties. The English distributed present of guns, knives, kettles, wampum belts, and a piece of red cloth. The Cherokee speaker, overcome by glittering show of the courtiers, ascended to those demands and said, "We look upon the great King George as a son, as a father, and upon ourselves as his children. For though we are the red and the white, yet our hands and the hearts are joined together. We came hither naked and poor as the worm of the earth, but you have everything, and we that have nothing must love you." In asserting a red identity, the Indian speaking 1730 London Council treated red and white as Moieties tying Cherokees and English to an alliance in which each had a distinct complementary role to play. During the ensuing decades, the Cherokees recalled the London Treaty often to remind, where we at? The London Treaty, that boy over there, get to it. Often to remind the English of the bargain they had made. As one Cherokee said at the 1757 council, I remember my father, King George, said that the white people and we were equally his children, and that both had equal right to the land. Our brothers, the white people, understand in making the clothes are the necessaries for us, and we understand fighting. So if you people will furnish clothes and other necessaries for us, we will assist you in defending the country. If the Cherokees were extending their conception of the town politics to explain each other's role in the alliance, the English were metaphorically to assume the role of the civil or white chief, and the Cherokees were to be the head warrior or red chief. A white chief of the Cherokee town did not actually clothe his townspeople, but he did oversee communal resources and responsible for welfares of the guests and the town residents unable to fend for themselves. White chiefs also mediated and advocated peace. Now, remember, they distinguished white and red in their own culture. They're not talking about phenotype. They're not talking about skin tone, right? Red was about war. White was about peace among the Cherokees. So don't lose that. So when they're talking to these Europeans, they are basically implying that, okay, you're going to be the peacekeeper and we're going to be the warriors. We will go to war to help defend and protect, and you'll come in and provide peace, a peaceful solution once the war has been settled. So white chiefs also mediated and advocated peace, although not truly seeking peace, but control over who fought with whom. The English would have appeared on the ritual stage of the diplomacy to be taken on the role of peacemakers. Simultaneously, the Cherokees derided the English ability to make war. These metaphorical positions of the English white peace and Cherokee red war found confirmation in the kin terms used to explain the Cherokee-English alliance. The Cherokees willingly became younger brothers to the English colonial governors and children of the English king. Within Cherokee society, white already had association with old and the red with young. As in the age structure of Cherokee politics, civil chiefs were usually a generation older than the war chiefs. The variety of contexts in which the Cherokees situated themselves as red shows that red did not have a definite fixed meaning. In one context, it meant the war moiety. In another, there was a hint of origins in red clay. And in a third situation, the red god of the East was ranked second, but otherwise lacked characteristics. Whether the Cherokees meant red people or painted people is equally ambiguous. The war moiety involved both red colors. Remember, we talked about the red colors. The god of the East was the color of Agaji, while origins of red clay would make one the color of Wadoji. If the Cherokees had a red identity in 1725 to 1730, it was just emerging. Most significant, these three examples show that the Cherokees became red as a consequence of trying to define whiteness. In contrast to the vagueness and the contextuality of what it meant to be red, all three examples give the same understanding of white. In the two stories told by the Cherokees conjurer, whites were ranked first because they had the knowledge of making all things. Indians were ranked second. The Cherokees also accepted these rankings at the London Treaty Council when they allied with the English in exchange for trade goods. Superior wealth and technology justified Europeans' claims to the high status category of white. Presumably, it was black status as slaves that relegated them to the lowest rank. The Tanas story about the three races leaving the cave used the same ranking based on wealth. The white man took the good road that led him to the fine hunting. Similarly grounded this ranking in the age of hierarchy, the white man was the first to lead the cave. The difference to the white superiority was diplomatic pose. For among themselves, the Cherokees said very different things about white people, calling them the white nothings, the ugly white people, and white dunghill files. We coming down. I know it. I know y'all tired. Hold up. Skip too many pages, bro. All right. Now, thus, in the early 18th century, the Cherokees elaborated on their own color symbolism to create a set of categories that stand for their diplomatic relations with the English. The rhetorical purpose of color-based categories became an even more transparent revolutionary war when the Cherokees rejected the former meanings of red and white and attempted to negotiate new meanings of the counter-American assumptions of conquest. As early in the 18th century, Cherokee speakers used their origin story as a base to explain social positioning, but they recast the origin story to assert precedence. At the 1785 treaty at Hopewell, Cherokee Chief Old Tassel said, "I am made of this earth, on which the great man above placed me, to possess it. You must know the red people are the Aborigines of this land." That's what he said. "And that it is but a few years since the white people found it out. I am of the first stock, as the commissioners know, and a native of this land, and the white people are now living on it as our friends. There is a distinct, clear knowledge of self during this meeting." In 1785, this chief had just told you that he is indigenous, he is Aborigine to the Americas. And the white man is his friend, is just now living on it. Now, Old Tassel's reminder to U.S. treaty commissioners that the red people were the original occupants of the land. Old Tassel's reminder to the U.S. treaty commissioners that the red people were the original occupants of the land constituted a Cherokee challenge to the U.S. hegemony that endured in the 1790s and 1800s. After complaining in the 1792 that we are bound up all around with white people, that we have not room to hunt, the little nephew said, "Though we are red, you must know one person made us both. The red people were made first. Our great father above made us both. And if he has to take into his head that the whites had injured the reds, he would certainly punish them for it." So in the 1790s, another Cherokee told some missionaries, "The great father of all breathing things in the beginning created all men, the white, the red, the black. The whites are now called the older brothers and the red the younger. I do not object to this and will call them so, though really the naming should have been reversed. For the red people dwelt here first." And in the 1830s, a Cherokee man told of how God made the first man out of red clay because Indians were red. They had obviously been made first. The red people, therefore, are the real people, as their name, Yahweh Yah, indicates. Thus, after the revolution, the Cherokees abandoned mutually agreed upon racial hierarchy that had granted whites higher status in exchange for trade goods. Yep, trade goods, higher status. There you go. Emphasizing their age and precedence as a people, they defined red differently to neutralize the hierarchy Americans thought they had inherited from Britain. Cherokee insistence that the red people were made first was partly a response to how whites regarded them. At Hopewell, U.S. treaty commissions claimed that they only wanted to make the Cherokees happy. Regardless of any distinctions of color or any difference in our customs, our manners, and particular situation, the Cherokee was skeptical. One Cherokee complained to the Moravian missionaries in the 1790s, but many people think that we Indians are too evil and bad and to become good, and that we are too unclean and brown, probably Wadoji. The Cherokee saw that skin color categories had become the predominant indicator of status in the American South, and black labor and red land the two most marketable commodities. English trade goods justified the Cherokees' difference in the early century, but now they were unlikely to gain anything in a racial hierarchy that was pushing the category red closer to the category black. Peep game. The wordplay and the invention surrounding Cherokees' uses of red and white give the illusion of complete plasticity. But it was only the meaning of red and white that changed with the situation. The Cherokees never claimed to be any other color than red. And the English, even when being insulted, were always white. By the end of the century, the color-based categories that grew out of the Cherokee color symbolism had become racial categories because the Cherokees described the origins of differences as being innate, the product of separate creations, and they spoke of skin color as if it was meaningful index of difference, but they persistently molded what race meant to fit particular contexts. So in the 18th century, Indians and Europeans were engaged in the same mental process. They experimented with the notions of biological difference in an attempt to develop methods in discerning individual allegiances. They adapted origin beliefs to come up with divine explanations for political, cultural, and social division. They dealt with the sudden diversity of people by creating new knowledge out of old knowledge, new color-based categories derived from their traditional color symbolism. Thus, the Cherokee conjurer, in Long's account, and lineages were compatriots in the same intellectual enterprise. The two groups also spent most of the 18th century expressing confusion and disagreement about the origins of the human difference, the significance of bodily variation, and how and why God or the great man above had created such different people. It would take another century for the science to race to reach its full height, and then one more century for the idea of race to be seriously questioned. Perhaps we are now to think at the brink of the apocalypse when the idea of race will be abandoned entirely and another system of categories will emerge to take its place. In the meantime, red continues to be contested. Indians may have named themselves red, but they could not prevent whites from making it a derogatory term. By the 19th century, whites had appropriated red man and put it in their own uses, appearing in novels of James Fenimore Cooper, captivity narratives, and dime novels, ultimately to be taken up on tobacco advertisers and national sports teams. The noble red men and the brutal redskins evolved into demeaning and dehumanizing racial epithets. But at the same time, Indians could always use red to claim a positive identity and to make a statement about difference, to build a pan-Indian alliance in the Native Women's Organization, which is called the Women's of All Red Nations, which Phoenix Moon is not a part of, Sister Betty is not a part of, none of them other women who claim to be Aboriginal or indigenous to the Americas don't know shit about the Native Women's Organization called Women's of All Red Nations, or to articulate Amerindian Indian grievances and in Divine Delaria Jr.'s critique of the Euro-American ethnocentrism, God is Red. The adaptability of racial categories to fit particular political or social alignments illuminates critical features of the idea of race in general. People do not believe in race abstractly, but instead manipulate racial categories to suit contextualize objectives. Yet scholars seeking to understand race as a cultural construction should exercise care not to dismiss physical differences between peoples as a pure figment of imagination. Why did Indians begin to see in skin color the potential for categorizing themselves, Europeans and Africans, but not use skin color to distinguish among Indians? Is it because there was indeed great observational biological differences between the peoples of Europe, Africa, and America than among them? There are physical differences. Our collective imagination organized the differences to make them meaning of them and are constantly at work altering those meanings. That's the end of this article. The fake Aboriginal community, right, is in trouble. You're in trouble now. So listen, I know many people can't get through an article like that. That was too many pages for a lot of people. You know what I mean? You're talking basically about less than 20 pages, and people lose their mind behind that. But that argument has to be had, because to double down on that, right? I have another source. I'm not going to read all of this source, but I just want to build on it just a little bit so that you can fully understand what we're dealing with here. So let me zoom in, and that should be big enough for you guys to see clearly. It's called Indigenous Americans Became Red, Racism and Justification, right? Exploitation of Native Americans. Tyson going crazy. So there's a recommended citation here just for that. You can see the Utah State University Library. But anyway, I'm gonna give you a little bit. So here's how it starts. Indigenous Americans became red, racism, exploitation of Native Americans. For most of human existence, the Americas were unoccupied by people. For most of human existence, the Americas were unoccupied by people. Modern man, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa and about 60,000 years began diffusing throughout the continuous continents, Africa, Europe, Asia. The amount of water captured by glaciers during the last ice age lowered the sea levels, and land bridge referred to as the Beringer emerged in the Bering Strait between Siberia and Alaska. Some East Indians moved to the Beringer about 15,000 years ago. When they did, they changed continents. Those were the first Americans. Recent DNA studies have revealed the Asians that populated the Americas late in the Ice Age came in waves of admixtures from a variety of locations and ethnic cultural groups. Over many thousands of years, migrations involving different interrelated populations expanded across the frigid Arctic and filled the continents down to the Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America. I'm going to rewind it back just real quickly. They didn't say that there were some people already here. They said these people migrated here via the yada, 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 and yada, yada, yada. We got evidence for all of that. So over many thousand-year migrations involving different interbreed relation populations expanded across the frigid Arctic and filled with the continents to Tierra del Fuego, that's in South America. Now, original social organizations was families which expanded to clans and eventually joined together to tribes. Though some remained in smaller relations called bands. Weaving and pottery were developed. Some animals were domesticated, including dogs, turkeys, plus llamas and Andes. Agriculture was first developed 9,000 years ago, though it took thousands of years to become widespread. With agriculture, the population grew larger. Some societies became more complex, and civilizations emerged. Dun, 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 dun. The colossal heads and large pyramids constricted by the Olmecs culture demonstrated society with political centralization. Class distinctions in cities existed beginning in about 1500 BC. Bordering the Olmecs were the Mayans, whose settlements dated 1800 BC. They developed a form of writing, understand astronomy well enough to develop 365-day calendar, as well as a long count calendar that extended 5,000 years, and did mathematics. Also in Mesoamerican culture was in the Valley of Mexico. I don't know how to say that, y'all. The Teotihuacan. This massive city of 9 square miles and a point of included 150 to 200,000 people was ruling a variety of people. In the early 13th century, the Aztecs arose in Central America and eventually took control of the Tarcan. Those warrior tribes conquered and ruled over 500 small states in Mesoamerica and controlled up to 5 or 6 million people. In South America, the Inca, who became in power in 1471, expanded their rule, the massive empire, including parts of what we know now as Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. 40,000 Incas controlled an immense empire that extended 3,400 miles south to the north in the Andes, with 10 million subjects to speak over 30 different languages. These master masons and craftsmen built canals, fortresses, 25,000-mile roads along with thousands of storehouses with food and cocoa for the first time of crop failure. Civilizations also developed in what is now the United States. The first urban center was the Cahokia Mounds, where the Mississippian culture built and lived in a series of earthen mounds, one being 10 stories tall and acquiring more than 22 million cubic feet of soil to construct. By 1200 AD, it was the largest Indian community to ever exist in what we know as the United States. Why are the Aboriginals not talking about that? Or any of this history, the war, the Indian Wars, anything like that specifically? Right now, remember, we just talked about how they called themselves red. They made those distinctions. This is walking you all the way through history, and then it's going to bring you up into those arguments. So you're going to hear something that sounds very familiar. Most early chroniclers described Americans natives as olive, tawny, or brown, occasionally russet or yellow. The earliest mentions of redskins was a reference to Indians adorned with red paint on the warpath. During much of the colonial era, it was believed that the Indians were born white, as was declared by Captain John Smith, head of the first English colony of Virginia. They took on the colors since many went naked and were constantly exposed to the sun. So, Captain John Smith, an Englishman in Virginia, said that they took on their color because they was naked and exposed to the sun. But here's how they turned. He said that they put ointments on the skin that stained, burned in ceremonies involving spending time in the smokehouses and other external factors. Early Spanish settlers noted Indians had straight black hair, darker skin, trimmer bodies, and the men had very little beards. This was frequently attributed to the diet. Climate was also asserted to this because of the races of John Davis in 1599, the world's sun. It makes the Moor and the Moor black, and the European white, the American tawny, and the Eastern Indian red. In the century following Columbus, the indigenous peoples of America were commonly referred to by European settlers as Indians, often West Indies, to differentiate them from residents of India. Other frequently used terms were savages, barbarians, heathens, wild people, brutish people. Sound familiar? The name American soon became reserved for the European immigrants and their descendants. The results of the Columbian exchange were tragic of the America's indigenous people. Before Europeans arrived, America suffered no measles, before the Europeans arrived. The people that was here, we're calling them Americans. They suffered no measles, no influenza, no smallpox, no chickenpox, no cholera, no malaria, no typhoid, no diphtheria, no scarlet fever, no whooping cough, no plague. It is estimated in 150 years following the Columbus with European colonization, these diseases eliminated 80 to 95% of the native population. At the time, some saw this as God's will. One was John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts Bay, who wrote to a friend in England soon after this 1630 arrival, "For the natives, they are near dead of smallpox. So the Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess." Europeans long claimed title to other people's land with two justifications, and these threads were bonded on and strengthened by racism and white superiority. First was religion, arguing that they were bringing the gift of Christianity to doom to hell. With the age of discovery, the Europeans hoped to find all the water route to Asia. Pope Nicholas V issued Portuguese King Alfonso the papal bull Dom Divorus in 1452. It was based on the scriptural authority from the book of Matthew 28 and 29. So you can turn your Bibles to Matthew 28 and 29, which is a reference that the whole papal bull is referring to. "Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world." The year after Columbus first reached the Bahamas, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull assigning to Spain a just title, the Americas, for the same reason. Portugal and Spain first divided the non-Christian world. Then England and others followed, also justifying the colonization, the spreading of Christianity, and saving the heathens. A second justification was bringing civilization to barbarism. Mayflower passenger Robert Cushman commented, "There are a few, but do not run over the grass, as do the foxes and wild beasts. They are not industrious, neither have they art, science, skill, or faculty to use either the land or the commodities." It was argued by John Locke, who asked in the famous Two Treaties of 1689 whether 1,000 acres of uncultivated waste of America yielded the rich inhabitants as many conveniences as 10 acres of equal fertile land due to Devonshire. I'm going to stop right there. I don't want to bore y'all. But what I want to bring to you is the fact that This red thing is essential because right here it begins to explain it. To explain the racial differences among the red, white, and black Americans, many monogeneticists argued that God had separated Caucasian Indians and Africans by altering color of Noah's sons, Ham and Japheth. And you should know that Noah was a tawny or red. That's what they say. Shem took the color and was the founder of the red race. God transformed Ham while he was in the womb and he was born black. Japheth, he emerged as white. Okay, some bullshit. Right? But we have to deal with this with scholarship. And that's why I read the first one to you, but it's here, right here. American robuscus, American red, reddish, obstinate and regulated by custom, European albus, Europeans white, white, gentle, and governed by law. Asiatic Elserides, Asians yellow, sallow, severe, and ruled by opinion. For Niger, Africans black, black, crafty, and governed by caprice. You have to look at these characteristics because they were used. Y'all remember when I brought up the Systema Naturale? Yep, this source uses that same shit too to make those designations. That's why I said I ain't want to read a lot of this because a lot of this is going to support the first article. And so I wanted to give you more than one source. Now, I don't want to hear people assuming that any of these dudes that's on YouTube are really Native Americans or indigenous or Aboriginal to the Americas. They're not. They're not scientifically. They're not historically. Right? And in the first encounters of Europeans and Indians, distinctions are made. But these distinctions are not made by the Europeans themselves because they were too busy calling themselves fucking Christians. It was the Native Americans that were making these assertions to separate themselves because these Christians brought with them slaves who just so happened to be dark-skinned, which was different. And the Native Americans made those distinctions themselves. And they claim to be themselves what we call red people. So they say, yeah, okay, you the whites, you the blacks. They made these distinctions. They were not influenced. Right? That's what the last article was basically arguing. Why you think the white people are bringing this shit, the fucking Indians was making their own distinctions. Just like the damn Arabs, when they came into Africa, they made their own distinctions. Because foreigners do that. But in this instance, right, a lot of their folklore, origin stories, use red. Red clay, red this, red that. So we don't need to hear none of that coming from them people. The science separates them. The history separates them. They're running in places and they're looking for allies, and now they're using a pseudo to justify. As far as your question, Thomas, how did Africans know? Africans determine themselves culture. They use culture. That's why you see the facial markings, the different hairstyles. That's how they knew who was who. They identified tribally by their culture. Now, when foreigners came in, foreigners made those distinctions. Black, and then they married. When I say foreigners, I'm talking Arabs. Arabs thought that North Africans who were lighter in skin complexion and kind of favored them had similar culture. So that's why you heard Sutek say Badani and Sudani, right? And yeah, the Berbers, Arabs, and Europeans, they were kind of, like this cohesive thing. And people below the Sahara were not anything like them culturally. So there was the distinctions and the differences. And, you know, they say what they say. So in the description of this video, I'll leave you these sources. I suggest you go back and read if you didn't have time. If you were just sitting here listening, I suggest you read it for yourself. Don't trust nothing that I said. Extract what you can extract out of it. Focus on your key points. And, you know what I'm saying? Everything else should be able to help you out. I don't know what Sute, what you talking about? And you know, big okay. Oh, you talking about that right there. I mean, I ain't knocking the people that put their cash up out there. Usually, you know what I mean? I don't really get into all of that. You know what I'm saying? We share a lot. We've been sharing a lot of knowledge, and we ain't been asking nobody to give us nothing. If there's anything that we did, we would rather, you know, put out our work, and we would want you to support our published books directly from us, not from outsources. And that would be one way to contribute to what we do. That would allow us to continue to do our research, build our programs and our platforms, and also allow us an opportunity to continue to fight the good fight, so to say. Right? But no, in no way, you know, do we really do that. If you asking for it, now if you ask me for it, I'll give it to you. But I'm not gonna you know, I'm not gonna advertise it like you see certain people advertise it, and nothing against them advertising it, you know what I mean? But I would rather, all right, let me give you an example. I would rather y'all be hitting people cash app that's telling you the truth than hitting people cash app that's telling you fucking lies. And a lot of it. You see what I'm saying? So I would rather you invest in the truth or support the truth than you hitting these cash apps with lies consistently. And I kind of stand on that. Yeah, similar to natives. They really didn't have to make distinctions. But there was one reason though, before the coming of the European and the Arabs, North Africans had this stigmatism towards people below the Sahara already. And they were enslaving people below the Sahara. They really orchestrated that whole Iberian Peninsula slave trade thing too. So you have to think that they always thought that they can go south below the Sahara to extract and send Africans. So Europeans, they were not. It wasn't like they weren't already familiar. They were familiar with a lot of the sub-Saharans. If we want to use that and want to use that word, they were familiar in some instances, but not in all. But you know, they didn't know anything about the gold and stuff in West Africa until some loudmouth mofo in Cairo started splurging, and then they just opened the floodgates, or they would have never, you know, did anything. Now I just think this going to India thing was to do what needed to be done, was to bypassing people and try to figure another way around to kind of counter their enemies and Prester John and everything else. There's a multifaceted argument there, but that's a different conversation, because when we're dealing with the new world, these things are happening while, for instance, the natives that had inhabited this land thousands upon thousands of years ago were building their own shit, going through their own turmoil, or you know, little inner beefs or whatnot, or still trying to populate the Americas and find these spots and build what they were trying to build. Uh-oh. I feel you, Kevin. Peace out, bro. You probably already dipped out. But yeah. That looks interesting. Dead City and the Fear of the Walking Dead. Season finale, yeah. And absolutely, you gotta think about it. Yep. Everybody around you black. So the only you ain't using black. You feel me? If everybody around you black, culture. The king of all things is culture. Yeah, Walking Dead did kind of fall off. I don't see any contention. I was looking in the chat. I mean, Shy One probably gone. Watch some Abo shit. What up, Mo? Doctor Mo. Everybody, Dr. Mo in the chat. Got a doctor. You know what I'm saying? Dr. Mo in the building. Dr. Lamb. I don't even know what to call you no more. You went from Sister Mo to Dr. Mo to Dr. Lamb over the last few days. So congratulations on getting your doctrine, fighting that fight. Now, don't be pseudo like a lot of these other PhDs now. We are not going to allow you to fall into the trap of the PhDs in the black community who have let us down, thinking because they now have gotten their PhD that they're going to make up some shit. Nah, we love Sister Moto. When she don't know nothing, she humble enough to just ask for the shit. She ain't gonna make up nothing. All right, so listen, man, I'm gonna let y'all have y'all evening. You know what I mean? It is Father's Day. It's the cheek clapping hour. For those of you who have cheeks to clap, you know, I expect you to put in work, represent. Those of you who do not, find you some cheeks to clap. Be safe. Do your due diligence. You know what I'm saying? Don't get caught up in the foolishness. If you're watching this on replay, I appreciate it. Make sure you play it back. This is informative. I know that there's a lot of reading, but for those of you who got through the reading part of it, you would understand the gist of the argument that hasn't been talked about. And that was this red distinction that the Indians make of themselves, especially the Southeastern Indians. That's significant. Not necessarily the Northeastern Indians, but the Southeastern Indians making those determinations using, conjecture of what they knew culturally as read to them, as a demarcation to separate themselves from these new white people that just entered the land that are carrying with them new black-skinned, complected people that they're calling their slaves. So it is what it is on that one. Yeah, appreciate that, Thurman. Appreciate that, bro. All the way. You know what I'm saying? It is what it is, you know. It is what it is. But yeah, man, we just need to be aware of what we're dealing with. Got to be aware of what we're dealing with. But yeah, man, I'm up out of here, man. Y'all enjoy, man. You know, put my earbuds in, listen to me some music. Nah, I ain't gonna listen to that. I'm gonna watch Extraction 2 on Netflix. Yeah. So I'll probably pass out. So y'all enjoy it, man. Spears are flying, pseudos are crying.